Welcome to the Fog Hut, where the rain whispers and stories come alive. Before you settle and to relax, share with us where you're listening from in the comments. Your support keeps these tales alive. First story. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. A passing remark from a coworker about something I'd apparently said the day before, a joke I didn't remember telling. I laughed it off, chalking it up to a lapse in memory. After all, who remembers every word they say? But it kept happening. Friends would mention plans I didn't recall making, meals I supposedly ate, or places I'd supposedly been. At first, I played along, embarrassed to admit I had no memory of these moments. But the more frequent the incidents became, the harder it was to ignore. My life was filled with fragments I couldn't piece together. The tipping point came on a Friday evening. I was at a bar with a few colleagues, unwinding after a long week. Sarah, from marketing, leaned over with a mischievous grin. "Still sticking to your no karaoke rule?" she asked. I blinked at her, confused. "I don't do karaoke." She laughed. "Could have fooled me. You were belting out Queen last week. Don't stop me now, right? You even got us all to join in." The others nodded in agreement, their faces filled with the kind of camaraderie that comes from shared experiences. Except, I hadn't shared it. I wasn't even at the bar last week. I was home, watching a movie. Or was I? That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts racing. The gaps in my memory were growing. Small things at first, conversations, errands, but now they were hours, entire evenings disappearing into a void. I told myself it was stress, fatigue, the natural consequence of juggling work and life. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. The next day, I decided to test myself. I set up a meticulous schedule, noting every task I planned to complete, every place I planned to go. I kept the list in my pocket, checking it compulsively. By the end of the day, everything seemed fine. I'd stuck to the plan. But on Sunday morning, I woke up to a series of texts from my friend Mike. "Nice seeing you at the park yesterday. Crazy coincidence, huh? You left in such a rush. Everything okay?" I hadn't been to the park. I hadn't seen Mike. Yet he clearly believed I had. Panic set in. I checked the mirror for signs of exhaustion, hoping to find some physical explanation. My face stared back, tired but unremarkable. I searched my phone, looking for clues, photos, call logs, anything to fill the blank space in my mind. Nothing. By Monday, the anxiety was unbearable. At work, I avoided my coworkers, afraid they might mention another memory I didn't have. Every interaction felt like a test, every casual conversation a potential minefield. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked at lunch, her tone light but concerned. "Yeah," I replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She nodded, accepting the excuse, but her eyes lingered a moment longer than I liked. Did she know? Did they all know? That evening, I sat at my desk, staring at a blank notebook. I needed answers, and the only way to find them was to track everything, every detail, every moment. I wrote down my schedule for the next day, leaving no room for ambiguity. When I finally went to bed, the notebook sat on my bedside table, a fragile shield against the chaos in my mind. The gaps in my memory weren't just lapses. They were something more. And I was determined to find out what. The notebook became my lifeline. Every morning, I jotted down a detailed plan for the day, outlining where I would go and what I would do. By evening, I would review it, comparing my notes to what I remembered. At first, everything seemed fine. The gaps were gone, or so I thought. It was a Tuesday when things started to unravel. I had planned a simple day, work, lunch at my desk, then a quiet evening at home. The morning passed uneventfully, each task at the office ticking off the list like clockwork. By the time lunch rolled around, I felt almost normal. Maybe I was overthinking things. But when I opened my notebook that evening, the gaps were there again. The afternoon was a void. I had no memory of the hours between lunch and the moment I walked out of the office. My notebook, usually a comfort, now felt like a weight in my hands. I stared at the blank space where my notes should have been, my pulse quickening. The following day, I installed a camera in my apartment. It was small and unobtrusive, set to record continuously while I was home. If I was losing time, I wanted proof. I wanted to see what I was doing when I wasn't myself. The first few days yielded nothing. The footage was uneventful, me eating dinner, watching TV, going to bed. I began to doubt myself, wondering if the gaps were in my head. But then, on Friday, I found something. The footage started normally enough. I came home from work, dropped my bag by the door, and sat on the couch. For an hour, I watched TV, my movements relaxed and familiar. But then, at exactly 8:47 p.m., I stood up abruptly, walking out of frame. When I reappeared minutes later, something was different. I moved stiffly, my posture rigid, my expression blank. I walked to the kitchen, opened a drawer, and pulled out a piece of paper. For the next half hour, I sat at the table, writing furiously. The camera couldn't capture the words, but the intensity of my movements was undeniable. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stood, folded the paper neatly, and placed it in my bag. The footage ended with me sitting back on the couch, my expression calm, as if nothing had happened. I replayed the video several times, each viewing leaving me more unsettled. The person on the screen looked like me, but it wasn't. The movements, the demeanor, they were wrong. It was as if someone else had taken control. That night, I searched my bag. The folded paper was there, exactly where I had seen myself place it. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, the writing sharp and hurried. The words weren't mine, yet they flowed with a purpose I couldn't deny. They are watching. The hours are theirs. Do not stop. I stared at the message, my chest tight, my breath shallow. Who were they? What did it mean? The next day, I installed more cameras, one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one in the hallway leading to my bedroom. I couldn't ignore this anymore. Something was happening, and I needed answers. By the time I went to bed, the cameras were in place, their lenses gleaming faintly in the dim light. The notebook sat on the bedside table, its pages open to a blank entry. I picked up the pen, hesitating for a moment before writing the date and my plans for the next day. Sleep didn't come easily. The footage, the message, the gaps, it all weighed on me, pressing against my thoughts like a vice. The shadows in the apartment seemed deeper, their edges sharper. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of light felt deliberate, like a warning. When I finally drifted off, it was to the faint hum of the cameras, their presence both a comfort and a threat. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. The cameras had been running all night, their quiet hum a constant reminder of the questions I couldn't escape. I avoided the footage at first, afraid of what I might find. But by midday, curiosity overpowered fear. I sat at the desk, the footage queued up on my laptop. The screen showed my living room, the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. At first, everything seemed normal. I was asleep in my bedroom, the stillness of the apartment broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards. But then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., something changed. The figure on the screen, me, sat up abruptly. My movements were slow, deliberate, as though I were being controlled by invisible strings. I walked to the living room, stopping in front of the camera. My face was expressionless, my eyes blank. For several minutes, I just stood there, staring into the lens. Then, without warning, I turned and walked to the kitchen. The camera in the hallway caught me opening drawers, rummaging through them with purpose. When I returned to the living room, I was holding a piece of paper and a pen. I sat at the table, my posture unnaturally rigid, and began writing. The strokes of the pen were sharp and aggressive, the movements almost mechanical. I wrote for nearly an hour, the sound of the pen scratching against the paper audible even in the recording. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I folded the paper neatly and placed it on the table. The figure on the screen, me, sat back in the chair, staring straight ahead. For several minutes, I didn't move. Then, at exactly 3:27 a.m., I stood, walked to the bedroom, and lay back down as if nothing had happened. I stared at the screen, my chest tight, my breath shallow. The person in the footage was me, but it wasn't. The movements, the demeanor, the intent, it was wrong. I turned to the table, where the folded paper still sat. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. When I unfolded it, the words stared back at me, sharp and deliberate. The hours are not yours. Do not resist. They will know. The room felt colder, the shadows deeper. I folded the paper again, my hands shaking, and placed it back on the table. My mind raced with questions. Who were they? What did they want? And why was this happening to me? Over the next few days, I continued recording, each night yielding more unsettling footage. The patterns became clear. I would wake at odd hours, retrieve paper and pen, and write messages with the same mechanical precision. The content of the messages varied, but the tone was always the same: warning, commanding, insistent. Do not break the cycle. They are watching. You are not alone. I tried to stay awake one night, determined to catch myself in the act. I brewed pot after pot of coffee, paced the apartment, and kept the lights on. But at some point, I must have drifted off, because when I checked the footage the next morning, it was the same story. There I was, moving through the apartment like a puppet, writing words I didn't understand. The walls of the apartment felt closer, the air heavier. Every sound, every shadow seemed deliberate, like a part of a larger plan I couldn't see. I avoided my friends and coworkers, afraid they might notice the change in me, or worse, that they were part of it. The journal, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. Its pages were filled with my attempts to make sense of the gaps, but the more I wrote, the less it made sense. The cameras offered proof, but no answers. The only constant was the messages, and the sense that someone, or something, was always watching. The more I tried to understand, the deeper the mystery grew. The recordings, the messages, the sense of being watched, it all pointed to something far beyond my grasp. Yet, I couldn't stop. Every new discovery, no matter how unsettling, only pushed me to dig further. One night, as I reviewed the latest footage, I noticed something new. It wasn't just me in the recordings anymore. At first, it was subtle, shadows moving in ways they shouldn't, edges blurring as if something was just out of focus. But as I rewound and replayed the footage, it became clearer. There was a figure in the apartment. It moved silently, its presence fleeting, but undeniable. It appeared only in the moments before I woke and began writing, as if it were orchestrating my actions. I froze the frame, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was tall, indistinct, more like a smudge on the screen than a person. But its intent was clear. It was watching me. The realization sent a chill through me. The messages, the gaps in my memory, they weren't random. They were deliberate. Someone, or something, was manipulating me, guiding me, using me. The next morning, I found another message on the table. It was written in the same sharp, hurried script, but this time, it was shorter, more direct. You are close. Do not stop. The words rattled me. Close to what? What was I searching for? And why did they care whether I stopped or not? Desperation pushed me to confront the people around me. I started with Sarah, the coworker who'd first mentioned my strange behavior. Over lunch, I brought up the gaps in my memory, framing it as a hypothetical question. Have you ever had days where you just lose track of time? I asked, keeping my tone casual. She looked at me, her expression unreadable. Not really, she said. Why do you ask? I hesitated. No reason. Just curious. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Then she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Maybe you just need a break. Stress can do strange things. I nodded, forcing a laugh, but her response only deepened my unease. She knew something, of that I was certain. But what? That evening, I decided to push further. I sent a text to Mike, the friend who'd mentioned seeing me at the park. I kept it light, asking if he remembered the encounter. His reply came quickly. Of course. You seemed different that day. Almost like you weren't yourself. Everything okay? The message sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to press him for more details, but something held me back. If he suspected something, I couldn't risk tipping him off. Not yet. The apartment felt smaller that night, the walls pressing in, the shadows darker. I sat at the desk, the journal open before me, and wrote everything down. The figure in the footage, the message, the conversations with Sarah and Mike. The pieces were there, but they refused to fit together. I played the footage again, this time slowing it down, scrutinizing every frame. The figure appeared more often than I'd realized, always at the edges of the room, always watching. It never approached, never interacted. It was simply there. By the time I went to bed, my thoughts were a tangled mess. The cameras were still running, their lenses pointed at the places where the figure had been. I lay awake for hours, the weight of the mystery pressing against my chest. When sleep finally came, it was fitful, plagued by dreams of shadows and whispers. The figure was there, always watching, always waiting. And when I woke, the message was waiting for me. Closer. Do not stop. The message haunted me, closer. Do not stop. It felt less like an encouragement and more like a warning. Each new piece of evidence, the figure on the recordings, the evasive responses from Sarah and Mike, added to a puzzle I couldn't solve. The closer I thought I was getting, the more elusive the answers became. I spent the day combing through old footage, replaying moments I'd already analyzed, hoping I'd missed something. The figure was always there, subtle at first but more distinct as the nights went on. Its presence felt deliberate, as though it was orchestrating everything I didn't remember. That evening, I noticed something new. The figure wasn't just watching, it was interacting. In one clip, it reached toward the table where I'd been writing. Its hand, or what resembled a hand, hovered over the folded paper before retreating. The action was quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I paused the video, my heart pounding. The figure wasn't just observing, it was involved. The realization sent me spiraling. I scoured the apartment for anything out of place, searching drawers, cabinets, and shelves. If the figure had touched the paper, maybe it had left something behind. But no matter how thorough I was, I found nothing. By midnight, exhaustion had set in. I sat at the table, staring at the latest message, closer. Do not stop. The words felt heavier now, their meaning just out of reach. I picked up the paper, turning it over in my hands, as if the act of holding it might reveal something I'd missed. And then I saw it. A faint imprint, almost invisible, on the back of the page. It wasn't writing, it was a symbol. A simple, geometric shape etched lightly into the paper, as though pressed there by something unseen. It looked like a circle with a line cutting through its center, dividing it in two. My mind raced. Was this intentional? A mark left by the figure? Or was it something else entirely? I traced the outline with my finger, the texture rough against my skin. The symbol felt familiar, though I couldn't place why. I spent the next few hours researching, diving into forums and obscure websites, searching for anything that resembled the mark. Most of what I found was nonsense, conspiracy theories, cryptic symbols tied to cults or secret societies. But one entry caught my attention. The symbol, according to an anonymous post on a forgotten thread, was associated with observers. The post claimed these figures existed outside of time, manipulating events to maintain balance or order. They were described as neither good nor evil, merely caretakers of a larger system. The idea sent a shiver down my spine. Could the figure in my apartment be one of them? Was I part of the system? The next message appeared the following morning. It was waiting for me on the table, written in the same hurried script. You see now. Do not resist. I stared at the words, my mind spinning. The messages were growing more direct, their tone less cryptic. It felt as though whoever, or whatever, was leaving them knew I was getting closer to understanding. But understanding what? That night, I set up an additional camera, pointing directly at the table where the messages appeared. If the figure was leaving them, I wanted to see it happen. The cameras were my only advantage, the only way to observe what I couldn't remember. When I reviewed the footage the next morning, my stomach turned. The figure appeared shortly after I fell asleep. It moved slowly, its form shifting and flickering as though it wasn't fully solid. It stood by the table, its head tilting as if examining the space. Then it leaned down, its hand reaching for the paper. The message was written in a single, fluid motion, the pen gliding across the page without hesitation. When the figure finished, it stood upright, its form lingering for a moment before dissolving into the shadows. The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the cameras. I played the clip over and over, my chest tightening with each viewing. The figure wasn't just an observer, it was an active participant. It was controlling me, leaving instructions, guiding me toward something. The final moments of the footage were the most chilling. Just before it disappeared, the figure turned toward the camera. For a brief second, it looked directly at the lens, its face, or what passed for a face, unreadable. It knew I was watching. I shut the laptop, my hands trembling. The symbol, the messages, the figure, they were all connected. But the more I uncovered, the less I understood. The pieces were there, but the picture they formed was beyond my comprehension. I sat back, the weight of the revelations pressing against my chest. The figure's words echoed in my mind, do not resist. The cycle was closing in, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold on. The footage of the figure staring directly at the camera haunted me. Its form, flickering and indistinct, was burned into my mind. The symbol I'd found, its connection to observers, and the messages, it all felt too deliberate to be coincidence. Whatever was happening to me, it was no longer just about lost hours. It was something far greater. I spent the next day in a haze, replaying the footage in my mind. The figure's actions were purposeful, as though it was following a plan I couldn't see. Every move, every message, felt calculated, designed to lead me somewhere. That night, I decided to push back. If this figure was watching me, guiding me, then maybe I could disrupt its plan. I rearranged the furniture in the apartment, moved the cameras to new angles, and hid the pen and paper it always used. If it wanted to leave another message, it would have to work for it. I went to bed, my heart pounding, the weight of my defiance heavy on my chest. The whispers, which had faded in recent days, returned as I drifted off. They were faint at first, indistinct murmurs threading through my thoughts. But as the night wore on, they grew louder, more insistent. Do not resist. The cycle must continue. You are chosen. I woke in a cold sweat, the whispers still echoing in my mind. The apartment was eerily quiet, the air heavy. I sat up, my eyes scanning the room. The furniture I'd moved was back in its original place. The cameras had been shifted, their lenses pointing exactly where they had been before. And on the table, a new message waited. You cannot stop us. My hands trembled as I picked up the paper, the words sharp and deliberate. The defiance I'd felt the night before was gone, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. I was not in control. I never had been. I spent the morning reviewing the footage, dreading what I might find. The figure appeared as usual, its movements slow and deliberate. It moved the furniture back to its original positions, adjusted the cameras, and retrieved the hidden pen and paper with ease. Then, as it wrote the message, it paused. Its head turned slowly toward the camera, as though it knew I was watching. And then it spoke. The sound was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. I replayed the clip, turning up the volume, straining to make out the words. You cannot resist. The cycle must remain. The figure's voice was low, resonant, and utterly inhuman. It sent a chill through me, the weight of its presence pressing against my chest. The footage ended with the figure dissolving into the shadows, leaving the apartment silent once more. I closed the laptop, my mind racing. The messages, the movements, the voice, it all pointed to one thing, the cycle. Whatever this cycle was, it was central to everything that had been happening. And I was at the center of it. Desperation pushed me to act. I gathered the messages, the footage, and my notes, piecing together everything I'd uncovered. The symbol, the whispers, the figure's actions, they were connected, part of a pattern I couldn't fully understand. But one thing was clear, I was being guided. The figure wasn't just observing or manipulating, it was directing me, leading me towards something. That night, I decided to confront it. I left the cameras running, turned off the lights, and sat at the table where the messages always appeared. The pen and paper were in their usual place, untouched. For hours, I waited. The apartment was silent, the shadows deep. The whispers began just past midnight, faint and indistinct, threading through the air like smoke. And then, the figure appeared. It stepped out of the shadows, its form flickering and indistinct. It moved slowly, deliberately, until it stood directly across from me. For the first time, I saw its face, or the lack of one. Its features were smooth, blank, a void where a face should have been. We stared at each other, the silence between us heavy. The whispers grew louder, their tone insistent. The cycle must continue, the figure said, its voice low and resonant. What do you want from me? I demanded, my voice trembling. The figure tilted its head, as though considering my question. Then it raised a hand, pointing toward the journal on the desk. Right, it said. The pen moved on its own, sliding across the table toward me. My hand trembled as I picked it up, the weight of the moment pressing against me. As the pen touched the paper, the whispers stopped. The figure stood silently, watching, its presence overwhelming. The words flowed from me, unbidden, sharp and deliberate. The keeper endures. The cycle persists. The shadows remain. When the last word was written, the figure stepped back, dissolving into the shadows. The whispers faded, leaving the apartment silent once more. I stared at the page, my chest tight, my breath shallow. The message was clear, its meaning undeniable. I was the keeper. The cycle depended on me. But the question remained, what was the cycle? And why had it chosen me? The revelation that I was the keeper of the cycle felt like a noose tightening around my neck. The figure's words echoed in my mind, the cycle persists. The shadows remain. What did it mean? Why had I been chosen? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Yet, I couldn't deny the truth in its voice. The following day, I scoured the messages and recordings for anything I'd missed. The figure's behavior, its actions, even its cryptic statements, they all seemed to point toward an underlying purpose, but the pieces refused to fit together. My notes became more frantic, my handwriting nearly illegible as I tried to connect the dots. By evening, I was exhausted but no closer to an answer. The apartment felt heavier than ever, the air thick with a tension I couldn't name. The shadows on the walls seemed deeper, their edges sharper, as if they were watching me. I sat at the table, the journal open before me. The pen lay beside it, its presence a silent demand. I stared at the blank page, my mind racing. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I refused to write. If I simply ignored the figure, would the cycle break? Or would something worse happen? The whispers began just after midnight. They were softer this time, almost coaxing, as though trying to soothe me. But their message was the same. The cycle must continue. The keeper must endure. The figure appeared shortly after. Its form was clearer now, more defined, as though it was growing stronger. It stepped out of the shadows, its movements slow and deliberate. It stood across the table from me, its blank face tilting slightly, as if studying me. "You resist," it said, its voice low and resonant. "I don't understand, I replied, my voice trembling. Why me? What is the cycle? The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it raised a hand, pointing toward the journal. Right, it said. I hesitated, my chest tight. What happens if I don't? I asked. The figure's head tilted further, its form flickering slightly. The cycle will break. The shadows will fall. And you will cease. The finality in its voice sent a chill through me. The figure wasn't threatening me, it was stating a fact. I looked down at the journal, the pen trembling in my hand. The whispers grew louder, their tone more insistent. With a deep breath, I pressed the pen to the paper. The words flowed from me, sharp and deliberate, as though they had been waiting to be written. The shadows endure. The keeper persists. The cycle remains. When I finished, the whispers stopped. The figure stepped back, its form flickering as it began to dissolve into the shadows. But before it disappeared completely, it spoke again. You are close. Do not fail. The room fell silent, the air heavy. I stared at the page, the words glaring back at me. The figure's final statement echoed in my mind. You are close. Close to what? The answer felt just out of reach, tantalizingly near yet maddeningly elusive. The next day, I left the apartment for the first time in weeks. The city felt strange, its usual rhythms slightly off. People moved with a mechanical precision that unnerved me, their faces expressionless, their eyes avoiding mine. I walked aimlessly, my thoughts a whirlwind of questions. In the park, I saw something that stopped me cold. A symbol, identical to the one I'd found on the back of the message, etched into the bark of a tree. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. I ran my fingers over it, the texture rough against my skin. Was this a sign? A clue? Or just another piece of the puzzle I couldn't solve? That night, the figure returned. It stood at the edge of the room, its form flickering as it watched me. The whispers began again, their tone more urgent than before. The cycle must continue. The keeper must not fail. I sat at the table, the journal open before me. The pen waited, its weight heavier than ever. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. Right, it said, its voice a command. This time, I didn't hesitate. The pen moved across the page, the words spilling out in a rush. The keeper endures. The shadows remain. The cycle persists. When I finished, the figure dissolved into the shadows once more. The whispers faded, leaving me alone with the journal. The weight of its presence pressed against my thoughts, a constant reminder of my role. I was close to something. I could feel it. But whether it was an answer or the end, I couldn't say. The weight of the figure's words, you are close. Do not fail, clung to me like a shadow. Each step I took, each breath I drew, felt laden with an urgency I couldn't explain. The whispers no longer haunted me sporadically, they were constant, threading through my thoughts even in silence. The symbol etched into the tree had been the final push. Whatever the cycle was, it extended far beyond my apartment, far beyond me. That night, I prepared for another confrontation. The cameras were set, the journal open, the pen waiting. The figure would come, it always did. But this time, I needed answers. Midnight came and went. The whispers began, faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. The apartment felt colder, the shadows deeper. And then, as expected, the figure appeared. It stepped out of the darkness, its form more defined than ever. The flickering edges were gone, replaced by sharp lines and deliberate movements. It wasn't hiding anymore. I didn't wait for it to speak. What is the cycle? I demanded, my voice steady despite the fear curling in my chest. The figure tilted its head, as though considering my question. The cycle is order, it said. The keeper ensures balance. Balance of what? I pressed. Why me? It stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. The shadows chose you. The keeper is always chosen. The answers only raised more questions, but before I could speak again, the figure raised a hand, pointing toward the journal. "Right," it commanded. I hesitated, the pen heavy in my hand. "No," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "Not until you tell me what happens if I stop." The figure's head tilted further, its form flickering slightly. "If the keeper fails, the cycle breaks. The shadows will consume." The word sent a chill through me. "Consume what?" I whispered. It didn't answer. Instead, it stepped back, its blank face tilting upward as though looking past me, beyond me. The whispers grew louder, their tone urgent, chaotic. "The keeper must endure. The shadows must remain. The cycle must not break." I looked down at the journal, the blank page glaring back at me. The pen trembled in my hand, the weight of the moment pressing against my chest. For a fleeting second, I thought about refusing, about throwing the journal and pen into the flames of the fireplace. But the figure's words, the whispers, the warnings, they felt too real, too immediate. With a deep breath, I pressed the pen to the page. The words came unbidden, sharp and deliberate. "The cycle continues. The shadows endure. The keeper persists." When the last word was written, the whispers stopped. The figure stood still, its form solid, its presence heavy. Then, slowly, it began to dissolve, its edges blurring, its shape fading into the shadows. But before it disappeared completely, it spoke one final time. "You are ready. The next will follow." The room fell silent, the air heavy. I stared at the journal, the words glowing faintly on the page before fading into the paper. The weight of its presence pressed against my chest, a constant reminder of my role. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the table, staring at the journal, the pen, the empty apartment. The figure's final words echoed in my mind, "The next will follow." Morning came slowly, the light filtering through the curtains weak and pale. The city outside moved with its usual precision, the people mechanical, their faces blank. I stepped outside for the first time in days, the journal tucked under my arm. As I walked through the park, I noticed the symbol etched into another tree. And then another. The further I walked, the more symbols I found, each one marking a path I couldn't ignore. The whispers returned, faint but steady, guiding me forward. The cycle hadn't ended. It had only begun. Second story. It started as a faint discomfort, a sensation I couldn't quite place. At first, I brushed it off, a trick of the mind, a symptom of a monotonous life. But as the days stretched into weeks, the feeling grew sharper, more insistent. Something wasn't right. I began keeping a journal. It wasn't anything formal, just a simple notebook where I jotted down my thoughts, daily events, and oddities I couldn't ignore. "Document it," I told myself. "If you see it written out, it'll make sense." The first entries were mundane. Wake up at 7 a.m., breakfast at the diner down the street, work at the office until 5 p.m., dinner at home, and sleep. The rhythm of my life laid bare on paper, unremarkable and steady. Yet something about seeing it there made my discomfort deepen. The sameness was too perfect. Then, one evening, I noticed it. While flipping through the journal, I saw that every detail of my days was identical. Not just similar, but exact, down to the conversation I'd had with the barista at the diner or the misplaced paperclip on my desk at work. The more I read, the more my chest tightened. This wasn't normal. I decided to test it. The next morning, instead of heading to the diner for breakfast, I stayed home and ate toast in my kitchen. When I arrived at work, my coworker Amy greeted me with her usual, "Diner run this morning?" I froze. I hadn't told her I went to the diner every morning. She just knew. The discomfort turned to dread. The following days, I tried breaking the routine in small ways. I took a different route to work. I skipped the diner altogether. I even called in sick once. But no matter what I did, the same events found me. Conversations repeated. Objects appeared in places I hadn't left them. The journal became my lifeline, my only tether to what I thought was reality. Every night, I documented the day, hoping for something, anything, that would break the pattern. That was when the people began to change. At first, it was subtle. Amy hesitated before speaking, as though she were waiting for a cue. The barista at the diner, who always asked about my weekend, started repeating her question mid-sentence, her voice hollow and mechanical. Even the strangers on the street seemed off. They moved in sync, their steps too perfectly timed, their gestures too rehearsed. I began watching them closely, scribbling notes in my journal whenever I saw something unusual. The more I observed, the more I noticed. Amy always turned her head to the right before answering a question, as if listening for instructions. The barista's smile faded the moment I looked away, her expression slack and lifeless. The strangers on the street never broke their patterns, even when I tried to disrupt them. The worst was the man in the gray coat. He appeared everywhere, at the diner, outside my office, on the corner near my apartment. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then I noticed his behavior. He didn't move like the others. He didn't speak. He simply stood, watching, always just out of reach. When I tried to approach him, he disappeared into the crowd. I wrote about him in the journal, devoting entire pages to his movements, his timing, his unnerving stillness. But no matter how much I documented, I couldn't make sense of him or the world around me. The realization hit me late one night as I stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. This wasn't just monotony. This wasn't burnout or a trick of the mind. Something was wrong with my reality, and the more I tried to break it, the more it fought back. The journal sat on my bedside table, its pages filled with my desperate attempts to understand. I reached for it, flipping through the entries until I reached the last one. The words stared back at me, identical to the day before and the day before that. Wake up. Diner. Work. Home. Sleep. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The man in the gray coat had been outside my window today, standing perfectly still as the world moved around him. He had seen me watching. He had smiled. Tomorrow, I would try again. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of determination, though it was tinged with dread. The journal lay open on the bedside table, its pages filled with the monotonous script of my supposed life. Today, I told myself, would be different. I skipped the diner, as I'd done before, but this time I went further. Instead of heading to work, I walked aimlessly through the city. The streets were eerily quiet, the usual bustle muted, as though the world were holding its breath. The faces of passers-by were blank, their eyes unfocused, their movements too precise. Then I saw him again, the man in the gray coat. He stood at the far end of the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, as though he belonged there. But I knew better. He was watching me. I changed direction abruptly, ducking into an alleyway. My heart pounded as I moved quickly, weaving through back streets and cutting through parks. But every time I glanced over my shoulder, he was there. Always at a distance, always watching. By the time I returned home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across my apartment. I locked the door behind me and sank into the chair by the window, my breath ragged. The man hadn't followed me inside, but his presence lingered, a constant weight pressing against my thoughts. I pulled out the journal and began writing furiously, documenting every detail of the day. The streets, the faces, the way the man in the gray coat seemed to anticipate my every move. As I wrote, a realization began to take shape. The people who avoided interacting with me, the ones who seemed out of sync with the world, they weren't part of the pattern. They were like me. But if that was true, why weren't they helping me? I decided to test the theory. The next day, I went back to the diner, sitting in my usual spot. The barista greeted me with her hollow smile, her question the same as always, "How was your weekend?" I ignored her, scanning the room for anyone who might stand out. Near the window, I saw a woman sitting alone. She wasn't eating, wasn't drinking, just staring out at the street with a faraway look in her eyes. When our gazes met, she flinched, her expression shifting to something that looked like fear. She grabbed her coat and hurried out, leaving our coffee untouched. I followed her. She moved quickly through the streets, her steps hurried but deliberate. I kept my distance, watching as she turned down a narrow alley and slipped into a building. I hesitated at the entrance, the sense of unease growing stronger, but curiosity won out. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew. The woman stood at the far end of the room, her back to me. When she turned around, her eyes were wide, her expression a mixture of fear and recognition. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "I need answers," I replied. "I know you're not like the others. You see it, don't you? The repetition, the patterns." Her gaze darted to the doorway, as though expecting someone to appear. "You don't understand," she whispered. "They're watching. They always watch." "Who?" I demanded. "Who's watching?" Before she could answer, the door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the room, and the air grew heavy, the shadows deepening. I turned, my heart racing, but the doorway was empty. When I looked back, the woman was gone. I stumbled out of the building, my mind racing. The streets were quiet again, the city's usual hum reduced to a faint murmur. The journal sat heavy in my bag, its pages filled with questions I couldn't answer. That night, the man in the gray coat stood outside my window again. He smiled, and for the first time, he waved. The man's wave haunted me through the night. It was a gesture so simple, so ordinary, yet in its context, it carried an air of menace. The shadows in my apartment felt heavier, as though they were pressing against the edges of my perception. I barely slept, the journal clutched in my hands like a talisman. The next morning, I resolved to find answers. If the woman had been aware of the pattern, there had to be others. The city was vast, and I couldn't be the only one noticing the cracks in its perfect facade. I started walking, my eyes scanning every face, every interaction, searching for someone who didn't belong. Hours passed with nothing. The streets felt quieter than usual, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. The barista at the diner repeated her hollow script. Amy at work turned her head to the right, waiting for a non-existent cue. The monotony was suffocating. Then, in the park, I saw him. He was sitting on a bench, his posture too stiff, his gaze fixed on a spot in the distance. His clothing was nondescript, blending seamlessly with the scenery, but his presence stood out. He wasn't moving, wasn't blinking. He was waiting. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. As I neared, his head turned slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. They weren't blank like the others. There was awareness in them, a flicker of recognition. "You see it too," I said, my voice low. He didn't respond, but his gaze didn't waver. I sat down beside him, my hands trembling as I clutched the journal. "Tell me what's happening," I urged. "You know something. I can see it." For a moment, he was silent. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "They're not real." The words sent a chill through me. "Who?" I asked. "All of them," he replied, his tone flat. "The people. The city. Even the sky. None of it's real." I stared at him, my mind racing. "Then what is this?" I demanded. "Why am I here?" He turned away, his gaze returning to the distant point he'd been staring at before. "You'll understand soon," he said. "But you won't like it." Before I could press further, he stood and walked away, his movements deliberate and unhurried. I followed, but as he turned a corner, he vanished, leaving me alone in the park. That night, the man in the gray coat was outside my window again. This time, he wasn't alone. A second figure stood beside him, their face obscured by the shadows. They didn't move, didn't wave. They just watched. The whispers started then, faint and indistinct, threading through the silence like a distant hum. They weren't coming from outside, they were inside my apartment, pressing against my thoughts, filling the room with their weight. I turned on every light, my heart racing, but the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, until they were the only thing I could hear. In the midst of the noise, a single word cut through, clear and sharp. Leave. The command sent a jolt through me, but when I turned to look at the window, the figures were gone. The whispers faded, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of my apartment. I sat on the edge of my bed, the journal open on my lap. The man in the park's words echoed in my mind. None of it's real. I picked up the pen, my hand shaking, and began to write. Every detail of the day poured onto the page, each interaction, each observation, each crack in the pattern. When I finished, I stared at the final line, my breath catching in my throat. The words weren't mine. They are watching. The realization that the words in the journal weren't my own sent a chill through me. I stared at the page, the phrase "they are watching" etched in my handwriting, but I knew I hadn't written it. My hand trembled as I closed the journal and set it aside, the weight of the revelation pressing against my chest. I spent the rest of the night pacing the apartment, every shadow feeling like a pair of eyes, every creak of the floor a whisper. Sleep was out of the question. The whispers from earlier still echoed faintly in the back of my mind, their tone insistent, their message clear. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment. The walls felt too close, the air too heavy. Grabbing the journal and a few essentials, I stepped outside into the pale light of dawn. The city was unusually quiet, the usual buzz of life muted. Even the air seemed different, heavier, as though the world was holding its breath. I wandered aimlessly, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer, fears I couldn't name. The man in the gray coat and his silent companion haunted my thoughts. Why were they watching me? What did they want? In the park, I found myself drawn to the bench where I had met the man who claimed the city wasn't real. It was empty now, the space around it eerily still. I sat down, opening the journal and flipping through its pages. Every word felt foreign, as though it had been written by someone else. A movement at the edge of my vision caught my attention. I looked up, my breath catching in my throat. The man in the gray coat stood at the far end of the park, his silent companion by his side. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched. I stood, the journal clutched to my chest, and began walking toward them. With each step, the air grew heavier, the shadows deeper. The city around me seemed to blur, its edges dissolving into an indistinct haze. The closer I got, the more distant they seemed, as though the space between us was stretching infinitely. Then, just as I was about to reach them, they were gone. The park was empty again, the stillness oppressive. I sank onto the bench, my chest heaving, my thoughts racing. The journal felt like a weight in my hands, its presence both grounding and suffocating. Flipping to a blank page, I began writing, the pen moving almost on its own. The words spilled onto the page, frantic and unfiltered. Descriptions of the city, the patterns, the cracks in the facade. Questions about the man in the gray coat, the woman who had vanished, the whispers in the night. My hand moved faster and faster, the pen scratching against the paper. Then, without warning, the pen stopped. My hand froze, as though caught in an invisible grip. The words beneath it were unfamiliar, written in a script that wasn't mine. "You cannot leave." I dropped the journal, stumbling back from the bench. The city around me seemed to shift, the buildings leaning inward, the shadows stretching toward me. The air grew colder, the light dimmer. I turned and ran, the journal forgotten on the bench, its pages fluttering in the wind. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun was setting, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. The whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. They weren't just in my mind anymore, they were in the walls, the floor, the very air I breathed. I locked the door, my chest heaving, my hands shaking. The journal was gone, but its weight still pressed against me. The city wasn't real. The people weren't real. Even the ground beneath my feet felt insubstantial. That night, the man in the gray coat appeared again. He stood outside my window, alone this time. His smile was wider, sharper, his presence more menacing. He raised a hand, pointing directly at me, his expression unchanging. The whispers grew louder, their chaotic chorus filling the room. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The words cut through the noise, clear and sharp. The cycle cannot be broken. The lights in my apartment flickered, then went out. The room was plunged into darkness, the whispers rising to a deafening roar. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the bed, my heart racing. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The silence was absolute, heavier than any sound. When I looked toward the window, the man in the gray coat was gone. But the shadows remained. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, their movements subtle but deliberate, as if they were watching me. I sat on the edge of the bed, my chest tight, my breath shallow. The journal was gone, left behind in the park, but its words echoed in my mind. You cannot leave. The cycle cannot be broken. I tried to convince myself it wasn't real. The whispers, the shadows, the man in the gray coat, it had to be a trick of the mind, the result of too much stress and too little sleep. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't in my head. It was real, or as real as anything in this fractured reality could be. The next morning, I left the apartment, unsure of where to go but certain I couldn't stay. The city was quieter than ever, the usual hum of life reduced to a faint murmur. The streets felt narrower, the buildings leaning inward as if they were closing in. Every face I passed seemed hollow, their eyes unfocused, their movements mechanical. I found myself drawn back to the park, to the bench where I had last seen the journal. It was gone, of course, swept away by the wind or taken by someone, or something. I sat down, the weight of the situation pressing against my chest. The world felt wrong, its edges blurred, its colors muted. Then I saw him again. The man in the gray coat stood at the far end of the park, his presence unmistakable. This time, he wasn't alone. His silent companion was with him, along with others. They stood in a line, their forms indistinct, their faces obscured by the shadows. They weren't moving, weren't speaking. They were just there. I stood, my legs unsteady, and began walking toward them. With each step, the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. The figures didn't move, didn't react, but I could feel their presence, heavy and oppressive. When I was close enough to see their faces, or lack thereof, I stopped. The man in the gray coat stepped forward, his smile sharp and unsettling. You've come far, he said, his voice low and resonant. But the end is not yours to decide. What do you want from me? I demanded, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. You already know. The figures behind him began to move, their forms shifting, their faces blank voids that seemed to pull at the edges of my perception. The man in the gray coat extended a hand, his gaze piercing. You are part of the cycle, he said. You always have been. I stumbled back, my chest tight, my mind racing. I don't understand, I whispered. You will, he replied, his smile widening. In time, you will. The figures moved closer, their presence overwhelming. The shadows stretched toward me, their edges sharp, their forms shifting. The world around me blurred, the park dissolving into an indistinct haze. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the apartment. The silence was deafening, the shadows deeper than ever. The journal sat on the desk, its pages open to a blank entry. The pen lay beside it, waiting. I picked it up, my hand trembling, and began to write. The words spilled onto the page, unfamiliar but inevitable. The cycle continues. The keeper remains. The pen fell from my hand, and I stared at the words, my chest heavy with the realization I couldn't escape. The cycle couldn't be broken. The man in the gray coat was right. The cycle would never end. The shadows on the walls shifted, their movements slow and deliberate. The whispers returned, soft at first, then louder, filling the room with their chaotic chorus. I sat back, the journal open before me, the weight of the cycle pressing against my thoughts. And outside the window, the man in the gray coat watched. He smiled. The journal's words echoed in my mind long after I'd written them. The cycle continues. The keeper remains. They weren't mine, yet they spilled from my hand as if something deep within me had known them all along. The whispers grew quieter after that, receding into the walls like a retreating tide, but the silence they left behind was heavier. I stopped leaving the apartment. The world outside felt foreign, its streets and buildings more like a stage than a city. The faces of the people were masks, their movements rehearsed, their actions devoid of meaning. Everything seemed to be waiting, holding its breath for something I couldn't name. The man in the gray coat appeared more frequently now, always standing outside my window. Sometimes he was alone, other times flanked by the figures who had joined him in the park. They never entered, never spoke. They only watched. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the apartment filled with long, jagged shadows, I heard it, the faint creak of a floorboard. It wasn't the wind or the settling of the building. It was deliberate, measured. Someone, or something, was inside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers returned, faint and indistinct, threading through the air like smoke. I turned slowly, my gaze sweeping the room, but there was nothing. The shadows on the walls seemed deeper, their edges sharper, but they didn't move. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the light didn't reach, a figure stood. It wasn't the man in the gray coat or one of the others. This was something different. Its form was indistinct, its edges blurred, as though it were made of the shadows themselves. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, its presence heavy and undeniable. The whispers grew louder, their tone insistent. I clutched the journal to my chest, its weight grounding me. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The air in the room grew colder, the light dimmer. I backed away, my heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The figure stopped a few feet away, its presence overwhelming. The whispers quieted, their chaotic chorus replaced by a single word, clear and sharp. "Right." The journal fell open in my hands, its blank pages stretching out before me. The pen lay beside it, waiting. My hand moved on its own, picking up the pen, pressing it to the paper. The words came unbidden, flowing from me like a flood. The cycle cannot end. The keeper remains. The shadows endure. When the last word was written, the figure stepped back, fading into the darkness. The whispers receded, the room falling silent once more. I stared at the journal, my chest tight, my breath shallow. The words on the page stared back, their meaning sinking into me like a stone. I was the keeper. I always had been. The man in the gray coat appeared outside the window again that night, his smile sharp, his gaze piercing. He raised a hand, his finger pointing directly at me. For the first time, he spoke. "You see it now," he said. "You understand." The words hit me like a blow. I did understand. The cycle wasn't something I could escape. It wasn't something I was trapped in. It was something I was part of, something I was meant to maintain. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, their movements slow and deliberate. The whispers returned, soft and steady, like the rhythm of a heartbeat. The journal sat open before me, its pages filled with words I didn't remember writing. And outside the window, the man in the gray coat smiled. The realization that I was part of the cycle didn't bring clarity, it brought dread. The shadows in the apartment seemed heavier, their edges sharper, their movements deliberate. The whispers were no longer faint murmurs, they were constant, threading through my thoughts with a rhythm I couldn't escape. The journal sat open on the desk, its pages filled with words I didn't remember writing. The man in the gray coat appeared every night now, his presence a constant reminder of the cycle's weight. He never entered, never spoke again after that one sentence, but his gaze was enough. He didn't need words, his presence was the message. Days blurred together. The city outside my window felt more distant, more unreal. The people on the streets moved like clockwork, their actions too precise, too rehearsed. I stopped going outside. There was no point. The apartment, the journal, the whispers, they were my world now. One night, the whispers changed. They weren't chaotic murmurs anymore. They were clear, deliberate, forming sentences that pressed against my thoughts like an invading force. The keeper must act. The cycle depends on you. The shadows cannot endure without the keeper. The words repeated, their tone insistent, demanding. I clutched the journal, its pages heavy with the weight of the truths I didn't want to face. The pen lay beside it, waiting, its presence almost mocking. I knew what they wanted. The cycle couldn't continue on its own. It needed me, my thoughts, my words, my actions. I was its anchor, its lifeline. With trembling hands, I picked up the pen. The whispers grew louder, their tone urgent, pressing against my mind until it felt like it might shatter. The words spilled onto the page, unbidden, unstoppable. The cycle must remain unbroken. The keeper must endure. The shadows must persist. When the last word was written, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise, pressing against my chest like a weight I couldn't escape. The shadows on the walls shifted, their movements slow and deliberate. They weren't just shapes anymore, they were alive, watching, waiting. The man in the gray coat appeared outside the window again, his expression unchanged. This time, he wasn't alone. The figures from the park stood behind him, their forms indistinct, their presence overwhelming. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched. I turned back to the journal, its pages filled with the words I didn't want to believe. The pen fell from my hand, clattering onto the desk. The shadows pressed closer, their edges sharper, their forms more defined. And then, the whispers returned. The cycle endures. The keeper remains. The shadows live. The words echoed through the room, their tone final, absolute. I stared at the journal, the weight of its presence pressing against my thoughts. The man in the gray coat raised a hand, his finger pointing directly at me. His gaze pierced through the shadows, through the whispers, through the weight of the cycle. You understand now, he said, his voice low and steady. You are the cycle. The shadows surged, their forms enveloping the room, their presence overwhelming. The journal glowed faintly, its pages pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The whispers grew louder, their chaotic chorus rising to a crescendo. And then, silence. The apartment was empty. The shadows were gone. The whispers had faded. The journal sat closed on the desk, its weight a constant presence. The man in the gray coat was no longer at the window. The city outside was still, its movements precise, its people mechanical. But the cycle remained. I sat at the desk, the journal before me, the pen waiting. The shadows might have gone, the whispers might have faded, but their presence lingered, a constant reminder of my place in the cycle. The keeper remained. The shadows never truly left. Even in their absence, I felt their weight, their silent presence pressing against my thoughts. The journal sat on the desk, its closed cover radiating an energy I couldn't ignore. The pen rested beside it, waiting as it always did. The city outside was still, its rhythm mechanical, its people moving like puppets on strings. The whispers had faded to a distant hum, but their words lingered in my mind, looping endlessly. The keeper remains. The cycle endures. I avoided the journal for as long as I could, but it was futile. Its pull was undeniable, an unspoken demand that I couldn't resist. The man in the gray coat hadn't appeared in days, but his absence only made the silence heavier, the shadows deeper. I knew he was watching, even if I couldn't see him. One night, as the apartment was bathed in the pale glow of the moon, I gave in. I sat at the desk, the journal before me, and opened its cover. The pages were blank, waiting for my words. My hand moved to the pen, the motion feeling both foreign and inevitable. The whispers surged the moment the pen touched the paper. Their tone was different now, urgent, desperate, as though they were pleading. Right. The cycle must continue. The shadows depend on you. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. The shadows on the walls seemed to stir, their edges blurring, their forms shifting. I looked out the window, half expecting to see the man in the gray coat, but the street was empty. With trembling hands, I began to write. The words came unbidden, flowing from a place deep within me. They weren't mine, yet they felt familiar, as though they had always been there, waiting to be released. The cycle cannot end. The keeper endures. The shadows must persist. As I wrote, the room grew colder, the air heavier. The shadows pressed closer, their forms taking shape, their presence overwhelming. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, their chaotic chorus filling the space. When the last word was written, the pen fell from my hand. The whispers stopped, and the shadows receded, fading into the walls. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating in its weight. The journal glowed faintly, its pages pulsing with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The man in the gray coat appeared outside the window, his gaze piercing, his smile sharp. He raised a hand, his finger pointing directly at me. "You have done well," he said, his voice low and steady. "The cycle continues because of you." I stared at him, the weight of his words pressing against my chest. I wanted to scream, to break the journal, to shatter the cycle. But I knew it was pointless. The cycle wasn't something I could destroy. It was something I was part of, something I was meant to maintain. The man in the gray coat stepped back, his form dissolving into the shadows. The figures that had stood with him before reappeared, their faces blank, their movements deliberate. They didn't speak, didn't move. They simply watched. I closed the journal, its glow fading, its presence still heavy. The whispers had gone silent, but their message remained, etched into my thoughts. The cycle would never end. The keeper would always remain. And outside the window, the man in the gray coat smiled, his expression a constant reminder of the role I could never escape,